So this is just a test um, to see if the recording process is working. But yeah, this is the first episode of what I hope to be a wonderful project that I'm bringing to the YouTube channel of Biology and Beyond, where we'll be exploring different facets of neuroscience, from mental health, psychology, and seeing how that they integrate with each other. So I feel that everybody would benefit from having an increased knowledge within these domains, as they are things that affect all of us. And the first thing I want to talk about today is what causes depression from a biological perspective. Depression itself is diagnosed categorically using the DSM-5 or ICD-10 criteria, which we can see here on the screen. The DSM-5 states that these symptoms must be present for at least 2 weeks, not just being down from time to time as we all are, and include things like depressed mood, markedly diminished interest or pleasure, weight loss, insomnia, hypersomnia, psychomotor agitation, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness, diminished ability to think, or indecisiveness, because there's a strong cognitive aspect of depression, as well as recurrent thoughts of death, recurrent suicidal ideation, or sadly suicidal attempts. Recently, grief was removed from the DSM-5 exclusion, which was quite controversial in the community of scientists, because it meant that people who were grieving would be classed as depressed if they were ticking off the boxes for these symptoms, which is obviously understandable that people would be upset in that time, and has led to some accusing overdiagnostic creep. Some of the risk factors for depression: there is a mixture of risk factors, including history of depression and family history of depression, hinting at a genetic component. Constantly being depressed and using the medical system a lot can lead to increased levels of depression. Chronic medical conditions, as there is a strong link between physical and mental health, as we'll come on to more later. Other psychiatric conditions being comorbid with depression, and hormonal challenges such as postpartum, peripartum, and menstrual changes, as well as during puberty. Depression itself is very heterogeneous. This means that the causes will differ from person to person, as will the symptom presentations. And this is one of the main reasons why treating and curing depression is far more complex than what we think than it should be. Our research is improving of what causes depression, but we're still a long way from a silver bullet, something that we can just use as a cure-all. It's not that simple. Serotonin in depression. So, this is probably something that we've all become aware of over time as a result of mass media coverage. Serotonin itself, or 5-hydroxytryptamine, commonly referred to as 5-HT, is a neurotransmitter in the brain, and it is produced in a two-step reaction, as we can see here. L-tryptophan, which is an amino acid, is oxidized to form 5-hydroxy-L-tryptophan and then decarboxylated to form serotonin. It binds to a receptor, like all other neurotransmitters in the brain, either at the pre-synapse or at the post-synapse, where it exerts its effects. These functions include neurogenesis, synaptic regulation, formation of dendrites, cortical development, as well as other more global aspects such as mood regulation, appetite, sleep cycle regulation, and the stress response. Serotonin hypothesis is one of the mainstays within psychological research, dating all the way back now to the 60s. It was first formulated in 1965, following experiments in people who had inadvertently had their serotonin levels reduced as a result of medication, and it was found that medications that increased the levels of serotonin would reduce the symptoms. Animal models, such as this mouse that we can see here, shows that the inhibition of tryptophan hydroxylase, an enzyme involved within the production of serotonin, reduces its levels and leads to depressive behaviours, such as reduced effort in the forced swim test. However, more recently, serotonin theory of depression has come under fire from critics and academics alike. To put it bluntly, it is insufficient to explain the causes of depression. The main areas of serotonin research provide no consistent evidence of there being an association between serotonin and depression, no support for the hypothesis that depression is caused by lowered serotonin or concentrations. Some evidence was consistent with the possibility that long-term antidepressant actually reduces serotonin concentration and may well increase risk. This was published for 2022 and it hit the media by storm, with many deeming the serotonin theory dead and invalid. However, it is still certainly an important part of the depression puzzle, even if it is not the full picture. So we like to look at serotonin and the cause of depression from a more integrated perspective, looking at other factors which cause depression from a biological standpoint. And we'll go through these factors now in turn. Here's a nice little schematic diagram from Page et al. 2024, showing all of the different factors and how they can integrate into some of the symptoms of depression, and then you see MDD, depression, in the centre. So it's very multifaceted with many different pathways interacting to lead to depression. That's a nice diagram to come back to. Emotions in depression are often impaired, and people with depression have a negativity bias or often describe themselves as being stuck. This is both cognitive and emotional in nature. People are more likely to interpret neutral faces as negative, as was shown by Godluska et al. 2016. Cognitive deficits include altered executive function and planning, attentional issues, memory impairment, poor cognitive flexibility, and they often see things in a black and white manner. Brain imaging studies, which we'll talk about more in a minute, have revealed various brain networks implicated in these changes, which is far more complex than just a single neurotransmitter being at fault for the disorder. Here are some of those brain networks which are distorted in depression. So I'll just run through these regions in turn so that we're aware of what they are. So here at the top in the yellow, we've got the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive functioning, planning, higher order thinking, and is the last part of the brain to develop. We've got the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center, allows us to feel pleasure. We've got the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory, and the amygdala, which is involved in emotional processing and is often referred to as the fear center of the brain, although its functions extend far beyond that and is involved in all aspects of processing, both positive and negative. These different networks can become altered as a result of depression. So if we have a look at these arrows here, the nucleus accumbens can become downregulated in depression as a result of less interaction from the prefrontal cortex, which itself reduces in activity, although does increase in activity when ruminating. The volume of the prefrontal cortex has also been found to be reduced within depressed patients. The wiring of the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, the fear center, has also been reduced. So the prefrontal cortex normally is telling the amygdala to shut up and quieten down. The hippocampus itself has increased connectivity to the prefrontal cortex, however, reduced volume and activity, which may explain some of the cognitive impairments and memory biases present within depression. Synapses themselves are dysfunctional in depression, with alterations to the neurons on the prefrontal cortex and hippocampus. Chronic stress often reduces the number of synapses that pyramidal neurons receive, which result in decreased excitation of the target neurons. When there is chronic stress, synapses seem to produce less dendrites for extensions at the end, as well as fewer spines, and this can underlie the reduced connectivity between the frontal cortex and other regions, including the hippocampus, which underpin the symptoms. So because of those less spines and less connectivity within individual synapses, that then affects these networks on a systems level. Now, one of the key proteins which is involved in plasticity, the ability of the brain to rewire itself, which is altered in depression, is called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, also called BDNF. BDNF is a protein involved in the protection of neurons, neurogenesis, synaptic remodeling, and plasticity, and it is essential for normal brain functioning. It has been shown to be reduced in patients as well as animals with depression. And it has been shown that when treating depressed animals, if the BDNF levels don't rise following the administration of antidepressants, then the depression does not get better, which suggests that even though serotonin might increase, if the BDNF is unable to rise as well, then that means that, and the plasticity isn't improved, then that means that the depression does not improve, suggesting that serotonin is just a piece of the puzzle and perhaps regulates BDNF downstream. It would also explain why serotonin, which is increased immediately, more or less, following the administration of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, does not work straight away. Other factors that affect depression and the wiring of the brain include adverse childhood events, and these have been found to have a dose-dependent effect on risk for later depressive events. Studies show that the more adverse childhood events, or ACEs as they're commonly known, happen early in life, increases the risk of depression, as well as all other psychopathologies, due to structural and functional changes within the brain and the way that they are connected, speaking back to those different networks. And here on the screen on the right hand side, you can see how different forms of abuse affect different regions of the brain, including the amygdala and the hypothalamus, leading to a perpetual state of arousal and looking for things to be wrong, or what we call hypervigilance. Stress is also extremely important in depression. Now, while stress might be beneficial in the short run, enabling to get us done, it can save your life. Stress being constantly turned on is a massive, massive issue in depression. So here on the right hand side, we can see the stress axis, or commonly known as the HP axis, standing for hypothalamus, pituitary, and adrenal cortex axis. Normally, the hypothalamus produces CRH, cortico-releasing hormone. Cortico-releasing hormone stimulates the pituitary gland of the brain to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then stimulates the adrenal cortex of the adrenaline glands to release cortisol, the final product. When cortisol levels are high, glucose is going to be metabolized at higher levels, and this is a normal part of the stress response to allow us to have energy for movement. And cortisol itself acts as a negative feedback molecule to turn off or lower the release of these other hormones through negative inhibition in the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary. However, depressed patients seem to have reduced levels of glucocorticoid receptor or reduced sensitivity to the cortisol, which means that this negative inhibition does not happen, and cortisol is being perpetually produced. And that is a bad thing for plasticity. It reduces serotonin, and it reduces the effect of dopamine within the brain. Also, cortisol is extremely potent at keeping us awake and will reduce sleep quality. Chronic stress response leads to also high levels of inflammation from the gut-brain axis, which we'll talk about in a minute, and leads to increased levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. Inflammation, which is normally there to help us, can be increased by infection and will defend against it. However, if stress is constantly on, then the inflammatory response will also be perpetually activated, and this itself can have similar detrimental effects, such as reducing serotonin and dopamine, poor sleep, breaking the blood-brain barrier and allowing pathogens into the brain as well as those cytokines, and also upsetting the gut microbiome, and even causing degeneration of neurons. I've mentioned the gut, and I'll do a completely separate episode on the gut. But what we see within our gut normally is that it is essential to our well-being by producing many of those amino acids that are important in neurotransmitter synthesis, as well as producing about 95% of the serotonin in ourselves. It's important for also neuronal development, inflammation, regulation of the stress response. So upsetting the gut microbiome by not eating properly or not having enough of the biogenic foods in our diet will also upset these other responses that we've just spoken about. Now, SSRIs themselves are commonly marketed as the cure-all for depression, and they are indeed a useful drug in some people. However, only 1/3 of people actually respond to SSRIs. in the first instance, and many people go through a bit of a roulette of treatments until they find what's right for them. They work by inhibiting the reuptake of serotonin, leading to more of it being present in the synapse, as we can see here, and therefore it's more able to exert its effects. However, as previously mentioned, they take about 4 to 6 weeks to actually work. Why this might be is because it takes time for the levels of BDNF that we mentioned before to improve. They likely actually work by enhancing the BDNF levels, which enhances that plasticity. This means that those networks of the brain which are causing the symptoms can be rewired back to normal. And this SSRIs can help induce the plasticity to enable these changes by increasing the BDNF and then leading to those networks to be improved. However, taking SSRIs alone is often insufficient for people, especially when they've had long-term or multiple episodes of depression, likely due to the severity of their dysfunctional wiring within their brain. So people taking SSRIs are often also prescribed a course of therapy or recommended a course of therapy, and this can range in time span for how long it takes to be effective, depending on the severity and how long the depression has lasted before it can be considered a recovery. Generally, it's at least 6 weeks, but many studies point to at least 20 for CBT, alongside antidepressants being optimal, although this is a figure that can change often. Many different therapies that are now being developed to treat depression all work through this shared mechanism of enhancing plasticity. Exercise itself has been found to be as effective, if not more effective, at treating depressive episodes and preventing future episodes. It increases BDNF and improves sleep. Psychedelics, which are being researched, such as psilocybin and LSD, can rapidly increase plasticity and BDNF, as well as ketamine, which has now been allowed as a FDA-approved drug in the United States and a drug for treatment-resistant depression in the UK recently. It works rapidly to increase BDNF levels, which may underpin its mechanism. Meditation and mindfulness also enhance the plasticity of neural networks, and I'll do a different episode on that, but they have also a very, very powerful effect if repeated for long periods of time. So it just goes to show that you don't necessarily need to take the drugs, although if you are prescribed them, then don't stop taking them, just based off this video. This is not medical advice, this is just science. Neuromodulation, which is shocking regions of the brain involved in depression, have some therapeutic efficacy due to the initiation of plasticity in those regions. CBT has also been found to alter the brain networks, enhancing the prefrontal cortex, which is normally shut down or reduced in depression. Of course, it is enhanced and augmented by the use of drugs such as SSRIs. Here are a few books that I would recommend to read. Why Zebras Do Not Get Ulcers by Robert Sapolsky. Lost Connections by Johan Hari, which explores the social and psychological factors of depression which may be overlooked. And Sedated by James Davis, who talks about some of the issues with antidepressants and modern ways of approaching depression. The references are also as shown on screen now. Thank you for watching.